Welcome to 3Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about Chris Colt, Dark Side of the Ring. And everything I know about Chris Colt, I learned from two sources. One, a Slam Wrestling article from 2021, where it's the first time I heard about him doing gay porn. And from Dark Side of the Ring, which is, of course, went into him doing gay porn. So, we're going to talk about gay porn for some reason. As a wrestler, he never made it into any of the books that I've read. He may have been a big star wrestler or whatever, but he never made it into any of the things that I actually came across. He's mostly known now for being a sort of liberated gay wrestler. At a not quite convenient time of the 60s, 70s, and the early 80s. And of course, drug addiction and dying. The story is pretty simple. He has a pretty stereotypical gay story. Grew up in a traditionally religious household. Kind of rebelled against that. Went out to become, something that his parents didn't necessarily agree with. Engaged in some homosexuality. He found a partner who was an older man. This almost always happens with young gay guys. They find an older man who helps them blossom into the gay male that they're supposed to be. This ended up being one of his tag team partners in wrestling, as they wrestled as the Dupree brothers, which was a sort of Hell's Angels gimmick. And this matters because as he goes forward into doing sort of the gay porn thing, this leather and chaps and chains kind of look is what he was going for, and was the kind of thing that attracted him when he used to read like gay magazines. Part of his gimmick was he named himself Chris Colt, even though Chris is not his name. He named himself Colt after a gay video. It's like a gay video series that was called Colt Videos or Colt Studios or something like that. And that's where the Colt name came from. And he was just basically into that lifestyle, the drugs, the partying, hard rock, that kind of stuff. They tell a story, and it's a pretty wild tale of him being on acid during a cage match and hallucinating that there were giant spiders all over the place, and he starts fighting them. This leads to him crawling out of the cage and punching fans and starting a riot and all this kind of stuff. And the drugs basically took over his life. It was part of his lifestyle. In 1976, his partner passes away from a heart attack, and he kind of sinks into depression a little bit. But that was pretty much the end. He would become, him and his partner were tag team champions in the Detroit territory, which was run by Ed Farhat. But other than that, he's mostly known for being an openly homosexual pro wrestler and for engaging in gay porn videos. Now, in the documentary, Jack Fleischer is there. And he was an interesting character to me because he, in the documentary, is talking about Hulk Hogan. And he's talking about how, basically Hulk Hogan was every gay man's fetish at the time, in the mid 80s, because he was gigantic, he was muscular. And I was like, wait a minute, these guys are fantasizing about Hulk Hogan, and that's where I made my mistake. Because I looked this guy up, and he's got a website, and his website is filled with, for starters, he's a very busy man. He's been writing since the 70s and doing porn videos or whatever. And he has a lot of material. And I tried to find the article in which he was lusting after Hulk Hogan, and instead found a bunch of other stuff. For starters, this guy, just Jack Fleischer, he is a proponent of what he calls homo-masculinity. What is homo-masculinity? Well, I found the definition for you. I found a definition for you that was written by him in like 1977. He says, homo-masculinity has liberated masculine-identified gay men. Homo-masculinity is a way of being, as valid as being a traditional sissy. Even though the politically correct misjudged that homo-masculinity means macho or sexist, it doesn't. Homomasculinity also recognizes homofemininity. The aspect of the male paradigm does not tread on the female paradigm, nor any paradigm in between. Homomasculinity is often a personal choice within gender style as much as it is genetic destiny. Many gay men do, quote, their mother's act. Other gay men act out the best of their fathers. Neither identity act is better than the other, but one is less likely to make a man a target victim. Consider this theory. As long as homophobes feast on the idea that gay men are or want to be women, they will abuse us the way they feel free to abuse women. Homomasculinity threatens heteromasculinity way differently than does sissyhood. So you see a lot of that, gender theory stuff in there about challenging heteromasculinity, and homomasculinity is threatening to heteromasculinity, I guess. It's a very interesting situation. In an article written about Chris Colt on Slam Wrestling, Jack Fleischer says, quote, identifying with giant wrestlers makes oppressed and intellectual gay men feel empowered, especially during an economic downturn when men whose jobs are shaky turn to their own muscles and to those of other men to prove they are in power and control even though unemployment threatens. I don't understand what any of that means. But in like 1987, 1988, Chris Colt goes into gay porn. And I looked to see what Jack Fleischer had to say about it, and he discusses something that I think is interesting. See, Chris Colt did not do traditionally gay porn. He didn't do gay porn with other men. He did solo videos. He may have taken pictures with other guys. I think he might have done a gay porn scene. But Jack Fleischer is a degenerate. All right. He lives in San Francisco. He is a self-proclaimed exorcist. He's also written books on witchcraft. He's done interviews with Anton LaVey, who is the founder of the Church of Satanism. This guy is a weird dude. All right. So he writes an article that's all about jacking off. All right. Clearly this episode is not for children. And he says, quote, interactive solo sex actors are hot partners, pal, offering you to crawl on your knees across the floor and lick the video screen. Because the solo sex star knows his purpose is to be there for you as a person, as a man, joining him in solo sex. No longer do you have to be a left out dweeb hiding in the bushes, watching two sex gods gobble each other, leaving you feeling like a dirty old man, like a voyeur in the video bushes. Now, this is the lead in to what Chris Colt actually did. So in the gay sphere, Chris Colt would be what's called a bear, which is a fetish. It's a big, burly, muscular guy who is sort of a homo-masculine. He's a traditionally masculine guy who just happens to be gay, essentially. So Jack Fleischer writes this. When professional wrestler Chris Colt decides to come out, for instance, he called Palm Drive because he has always, as a performer in the square circle, considered himself a solo act. What Chris Colt does in Palm Drive video is turbocharged into high sex jacking off with the crowd baiting, shouting, and macho bravado that so many of us love to watch wrestlers like Billy Jack Haynes, Rick Rude, and the Road Warriors engage in, attacking the camera between bouts. This is a recurring thing with Jack Fleischer and a few of the PDFs I flipped through, is that he typically uses traditionally masculine dudes as imagery. Quite often these guys are black, like Ken Norton, the boxer Ken Norton, or Muhammad Ali, or O.J. Simpson. And he goes into that stuff a lot. Hulk Hogan is a recurring thing too, and so is Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornado. As he writes fictional stories, sometimes he uses Hulk Hogan and Kerry Von Erich or whatever as an idea of For him, wrestling is a lot about male contact because he's a homosexual and that's what he's thinking about and that's what he imagines. And to him, that is erotic. So he writes that kind of stuff. So he'll often write about O.J. Simpson in the 70s, of course. And when he would write later, like in the 80s, he would use Hulk Hogan or Kerry Von Erich. So he would update the image of, the kind of guy that he would want slamming him and all this kind of stuff, right? So in the Slam Wrestling article, he talked about Chris Colt. He says, quote, he was a specialty act and not particularly interested in being a generic gay porn star for other studios. He came to me because my erotic films are video portraits of the subject, catching emotive nuance that a still photo misses, but a freeze frame can capture. He wanted to see himself in a new way on screen. He then also explains why people might find Chris Colt interesting as a sexual object. He says, quote, Chris filled a needed slot. He was one of those men whose look was so gruff and gross that it was all the turn on of Beauty and the Beast. To refined gay men in love with received beauty, Chris had perverse appeal as the brutal man who is so ugly that he is sexy. Therefore, gets laid a lot as long as he stays in character. And this is the kind of stuff that Chris Colt was involved with. And these were the kinds of people that he was involved with. So outside of the fact that he had been out of the business for a little while, the reason he even got into gay porn was, as Jack Fleischer is going to explain to us, because he wanted to sort of have some kind of revenge against the wrestling business. Jack Fleischer says in the Slam Wrestling article from 2021, Chris Colt contacted me because he had reached a certain stage of maturity. He wanted to slap his regional wrestling circuit across the face for all the shit he had to put up with in the ring and from management. He knew that on set, I would unleash him and let him do what he wanted to do, precisely to piss off his peers, especially those pro wrestlers who are gay and closeted, and the worst ones, the pro wrestlers who are straight and homophobic. The author of the article, whose name escapes me at the moment, wrote, Pro wrestling has two facets when it comes to homosexuality. One face depicts the overly effeminate villains like Adrian Street, who prance to the beat of the crowd's homophobic slurs. That's the one seen on television where the audience is conditioned to only cheer the heterosexual combatants. The other face is the one hidden from the majority of fans. And then we go back to Jack Friser, who says, quote, Colt wanted to pull back the wizard's curtain on what he said were pro wrestling's two biggest secrets, homosexuality and hustling. He continues, sex, paid for one way or the other, exists between some athletes, trainers, management, and fans. We're going to pause it right here because this is what it sounds like when we talking about like the cream team in the WWF, right? The ring boy scandal, where a lot of the ring boys were basically told in order to keep their jobs that they had to service a lot of these older, more established veteran wrestlers. And this stuff ended up being a huge issue in the WWF, right? So keep that in your mind. He says, quote, this is Jack Friser again. He says, hustling by pro wrestlers who put on private one-on-one shows posing for gay men in hotel rooms is big business in the underground world of homosexuality. That can mean that the marquee name does his pro wrestling act of muscles and trash talk, often in full TV costume, while the John masturbates. He says, to the degree that TV pro wrestling is one of the main entertainments in American pop culture, gay videos likewise thrive on pro wrestling attitudes, fetish clothing, whips and chains, and alpha male fighting action by homo-masculine men who wrestle in gay videos as heels and jobbers, do the moves and the pins, which are all done with an erotic man-to-man spin. Whoo, brother. All right, so you could take that element and understand that in women's wrestling, there was always an issue of what they called apartment wrestling. Now, what this means is I have to go to a book. Finally, I get to get away from the gay stuff. The book is The Sisterhood of the Square Circle by Pat LaPrade and Dan Murphy. In the book, they talked about apartment wrestling. So here's a little of what they talked about. It says sex appeal has been an inherent part of women's wrestling since its earliest days as a novelty attraction on the carnival circuit. The erotic and sensual components were important when women and men showed their perfect body outlines. At times, that sex appeal has been subtle, and at times it's been more overt. And then Mildred Burke says wrestling has always had strong sex appeal. Fantasies are lived out by fans through the various personages in wrestling. Right and wrong and good and evil meet in a primal struggle under the lights. Human beings are sexual beings, all of them. The wrestling game allows all manner of drives and frustrations to be vented. And they start talking about, of course, women dressing sexually, but mostly this was a big scandalous thing about women's wrestling, is that female wrestlers would often be hired to go into apartments where they would pose. And the poses would be sexual, but they would be wrestling poses. Like you put a woman in a Boston crab, and she would be in a scantily clad outfit or something like that. And these things would often be utilized as fetish objects. So in the book it says, in 1973, magazine publisher Stanley Weston introduced the world to a new sort of women's wrestling. Weston had founded Boxing Illustrated Wrestling News in 1958 and had developed that brand into several boxing and wrestling magazines, including The Ring, The Wrestler, and Inside Wrestling. Pro Wrestling Illustrated, which would become the flagship wrestling magazine in the group, was introduced in 1979. Magazine sales were down, and Weston wanted to try something novel. And Bill Apter says, Stanley Weston calls me in, opened up the package from Theo Errett, our Los Angeles photographer, and says, look at this. It's bikini-clad hot babes in wrestling in an apartment. And that was the plan. And it continues, there was little competitive pretense to apartment wrestling. Models in suggestive wrestling poses were photographed in bikinis or lingerie, resulting in little difference between apartment wrestling and a Playboy pictorial. Weston ran a special on apartment wrestling and sports review wrestling, much to Apter's chagrin. To continue a little bit, it's from the book. It says, apartment wrestling had plenty of critics within the wrestling industry, including Vince McMahon Sr., who threatened to revoke the magazine's press access if the feature wasn't pulled. Apartment wrestling was essentially softcore pornography tucked in the pages of a wrestling magazine. Several wrestlers hated having their photos and names in magazines that often featured that smut. So what you have is there is a gay version of the same thing that the women were doing. And you almost never hear about that because, women are always being exploited and women are always the problem. You never really hear that men did it too. And also you almost never see pictures of that stuff, which is, good, right? So the Chris Colt story is, a lot of it is about homosexuality and embracing his homosexuality and how he chose to use it, but also be somewhat discreet in doing so. But the reason I focused a lot on the sexual element of it is because it's the most interesting part. How many wrestlers have done, gay porn? And this is not just he did porn. He specifically did gay porn. He was inspired by gay porn, in his name. He wore chaps and leather and all this sort of stuff, knowing that there was a fetish for that sort of thing. And he played into it and he participated in it. So it was a very interesting story from that, perspective. His career never reached the level of him being featured in any of the books that I've read. So to me, this is the part that jumps out. And I think this was the reason this episode was even done. So it's a very interesting story. So if you watch Dark Side of the Ring on Chris Colt, it's a dark side for sure. The drugs, the partying, the lifestyle, all that sort of stuff. It's interesting. But, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort